Hello, and welcome to the Poison Paint Factory. My factory designated name is Poison226. Nice to meet you. A silver face shines down on New York. A stranger smiles and contemplates his next move. A spectre watches through radiant eyes. The night breeze embraces him like a long-lost lover, tugging at his flowing cape to follow her down to the street below. He almost feels gnarled, bony talons pushing into the small of his back, as if to hurry him along. Almost. A whisper in his ear from a lipless mouth clicks and clacks, almost reedy in its tone, tells him now is the time, and the stranger listens. He lifts up his heavy body to its full height and jumps. The ground rushes to greet him, but he doesn't care. He's died once before. He's not afraid to die again. The men on the pavement see a looming shadow cast by the moonlight, and they draw their weapons as if extending their hands in greeting with deadly intent. He doesn't care. He likes it when they see him coming. The thrill of the hunt, the rush of adrenaline, his spirits rise. His spirit guide tells him these are the men, but will it tell him when to stop? When enough is enough, when he can finally rest. A silver face shines down on New York. A stranger smiles as crimson petals stain ghost white robes. Who is Moonknight? Isn't Moonknight just Marvel's version of Batman? And what if Moonknight had a child? Could they gain patronage of a god too? Today, I want to talk about the superhero, Moonknight. Put on your mask, grab your cape, or a nice sharp suit. Feel free to leave your sanity at the door. Remember, nighttime is the right time to kick some butt. While I've got your attention, can you make a guess on how this video connects with the last? What does Moonknight and Mick Foley have in common? Disclaimer. A lot of the information presented in this video is public information that I researched alongside my interpretation and opinions. Sources will be linked in the description below, and yes, there will be spoilers. So, with all that said, let's get to it. What is Moonknight? Moonknight looks like this, or this, sometimes like this, and even like this. But he still looks like this. Bear with me, let me explain. Moonknight is the human avatar of Khonshu. Think of him as Khonshu's representative on the physical plane. Cool, but who is Khonshu? Well, stepping away from Marvel for a second, the real Khonshu was an Egyptian god of the moon and time. His name translates as traveller or to cross, but he is also known by the terms embracer, pathfinder, defender, and healer. Obviously, one of his powers was that of a healer, but he also protected travellers at night, could influence fertility in humans and livestock. And if you want to understand how powerful of a god he was, well, in one myth, he had a prominent role in creating the universe. So yeah, pretty powerful. So Khonshu is a good god then? Well, that depends. Early in his history, he was actually known to be violent and bloodthirsty. He's actually referred to in one text as Khonshu who lives on hearts, so not so good. Later he is known to be a gentle and compassionate god, so I guess he chilled out in his old age. Something else that I found interesting is that Khonshu has different aspects based on the phases of the moon, and they could talk to one another. Oh, and he enjoys playing games like Senet. This will become relevant shortly, trust me. Back to Marvel and Moonknight. Moonknight is known as the Knight of Vengeance or the Fist of Khonshu. Do you remember what I said about Khonshu's powers earlier? Well, Khonshu's powers are Moonknight's powers, right? Moonknight only borrows his powers, which can be taken away at a whim should the god's favour ever change. With this favour, Moonknight has the ability to heal, and often has prophetic visions brought on by Khonshu. As for the fertility thing, I think I'd rather stay ignorant than Google it. Moonknight not only has a literal god watching his back, but he also has similar powers to a certain bat-themed DC hero. Expert detective, martial artist, weapons expert, bottomless wallet, which translates as endless moon-themed gadgets and vehicles. Oh, and a foreign butler or butler-like helper, or two. So yes, I do get the criticisms that people have that Moonknight is Marvel's version of Batman. And if you look hard enough, you might even find the same artist working on both comics at one time or another. But these are very much just surface and bullet point comparisons. When you start looking into Moonknight, there is so much more. The differences are what make him stand out. Let's start with something obvious. Batman wears black. This is to blend in with the darkness and catch his prey unaware. Moonknight, on the other hand, wants to be seen. He causes fear in his foes by the sheer lunacy of a man dressed in all white running headlong into battle. Crazy he could be. While Batman is cool, calm and collected, Moonknight is like the most violent version of Batman, who also talks to himself, be it to Khonshu, who only he can see, or another alter of himself. Yes, Moonknight suffers from D.I.D. That's dissociative identity disorder, which is a real disorder. Because I'm not a real doctor, I've lifted this brief explanation right from the NHS website. Dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder. They may feel the presence of other identities, each with their own names, voices, personal histories and mannerisms. Some dissociative disorders are very short-lived, perhaps following a traumatic life event and resolve on their own in a matter of weeks or months. Others last much longer. In basic terms, Moonknight contains several personalities that manifest as different people in the same body. Sometimes without the knowledge of the others, sometimes they can have full-blown conversations, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, so that's the elephant, or bat, in the room dealt with. In the Marvel universe, Khonshu doesn't have the power he once had and has to work through a vessel, hence the whole Fist of Khonshu thing, a hand to do his bidding. There have been many Moonknights in the Marvel universe, but the current and main one is Markspector. Markspector and Al Simmons would have either been best friends or the most bitter rivals, with them both being expert mercenaries before their untimely deaths. See my Spawn video series for more info on Mr. Simmons. In life, Mark was lucky enough to be born into a wealthy family, but cast this off for a life of violence and hardship, becoming a Marine, joining the CIA and finally a mercenary when he became disillusioned with the previous occupation. While travelling the globe doing bad things for good money, he met and became friends with the foreign legionary, Jean-Paul Duchamp, better known as Frenchie. Frenchie was an expert pilot and served Mark on his vigilante escapades as something as a more hands-on Alfred to Batman, or maybe an older and more French Robin, especially in the earlier days of the hero's story. Before Mark became Moonknight, he would have to rise and fall like the moon, before he could rise once again. Mark took on a job helping the terrorist Raoul Bushman in Egypt, until he had an attack of conscience and tried to stop Bushman from murdering unarmed archaeologists. This would prove fatal for Mark, but the Egyptian god Khonshu had other plans, making Mark his latest fist of vengeance, resurrecting him from the dead as Moonknight. If Markspector and Al Simmons were besties, Steven Grant and Bruce Wayne would have been business lunch buddies. Steven has the wealth to achieve almost anything, from custom helicopters the shape of the moon, to sleek white limos with personalised number plates, and everything in between. Bear in mind, this is the Steven Grant from the comics and not the TV series. I'm saving talking about that until later. Something I find funny about Steven is that he's often underutilised in the comics, and used more as a source of income for his other personalities, and yet he is super charismatic. A charismatic enigma, if you will. Perfect for learning about the corrupt elite born with silver spoons. So Spector's got Simmons, Grant has Wayne. Who does Jake Lockley have? Well, I'd have to say someone like Wolverine or maybe Frank Castle, aka Punisher. I'm not sure who would be more terrifying to bump into at night. Okay, that would be Punisher, but that's a story for another day. What I'm trying to say is, Jake is a bit rough and ready, but he's down to earth. He's either driving people around in his taxi, or at Gina's diner, speaking to his informants. Friends, Crawley and Gina. Jake deals with the scum at the bottom of the ladder. He finds out about the down and outs and street level criminals. He's more inclined to talk simply and in slang, but don't take that as stupidity. He's sharp and street smart, so don't underestimate him or his anger. He doesn't mind getting his hands dirty once in a while. He tends to get a bit more page time than his upper class compatriot, Steven, but nothing compares to Mark. Again, I want to stress that this is the Jake in the comics and not the TV show. I'll talk about that shortly. Fans of the Moonknight TV series, bear with me, we'll get to that, may recognise the name donperlin. He is the fictional actor who played the fictional Stephen Grant of the Indiana Jones show that Mark and his brother enjoyed so much. Well, wouldn't you know? The creators of Moonknight were dougmoench and donperlin. Little touches in Marvel media like this are so nice to see. If only the artists got better deals when it came to royalties, but anywho, in Perlin's words, Moonknight was developed by Doug and I for Werewolf. I designed the first costume. Marvel wanted us to come up with a new costumed hero to help sales of the title. Moonknight was eventually featured in 2 issues of Marvel Spotlight. Then we never heard about the character again. Down the line they revived him, but I never had a hand on it again. Perlin also helped create the Bloodshot character as played by Vin Diesel in the 2020 movie of the same name. Co-creator of Moonknight and writer of the Werewolfbynight series, Doug is a prolific comic book writer who is probably best known for his runs on Batman, Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu, and Deathlock the Demolisher. He not only co-created Moonknight, but also Bane, the crime lord Black Mask, Deathlock, and finally Colleen Wing. Lastly, I feel I have to mention this, as I spoke about this briefly in my Joker video. Doug was one of the men who brought us the tragic character Jason Todd, the second Robin in the Batman issue 366, way back in 1983. Moonknight first appeared in issue 32 of Werewolfbynight. Why here, you ask? Well, the titular werewolf needed a new antagonist and Moonknight was very much made to order. He was themed around the moon, used silver gauntlets and boots, and was everything the protagonist wasn't. Perlin had been drawing werewolf since issue 17 and was joined by Doug from issue 20. Their run together lasted until issue 43 when the series ended. As for his appearance in the comic, Moonknight is introduced after his initial scrap with Werewolf as Markspector, a decorated military man turned mercenary who is hired by the Committee to dress up in some superhero gimmick to capture Werewolf alive. So the Egyptian theming wasn't there from his inception, neither were his other personalities, but he had the look, the gadgets and his trusty sidekick Frenchie along with his helicopter, even if it wasn't moon themed yet. The issue ends with the werewolf being defeated at the hands of Moonknight. Frenchie captures the werewolf's sister and best friend, and they all fly off in the helicopter to get their reward from the Committee. This story is concluded in issue 33. Werewolf comes to while they're still in the air and knocks both himself and Moonknight into the water below. They fight for some time on the pier, and it looks like Werewolf was going to get the better of the Cape Crusader until dawn breaks and he turns back into his human form, Jack Russell. Yes, really. The creator had no idea he named the main character after a breed of dog, or so he says. As Jack, he feels the pain of their battle much more keenly and is knocked unconscious. Frenchie comes back to pick them up in the chopper, and they go get their money. The Committee stall them and refuse to believe that Jack is the werewolf. Well, until he turns with the full moon. Turns out, they want the werewolf for a pet, and to do select murders for them. Moonknight can't abide this, and frees Werewolf on the businessman. They don't put up much of a struggle, and Jack and Mark go their separate ways. So that was Moonknight's first appearance in the comic books, but maybe you think that doesn't count? How about his features in Marvel Spotlight, where his origin from werewolf was retconned and played out as an undercover mission to get at the Committee? Still doesn't count? What about his many features in several other heroes comics? It only counts if he gets his own series? Well, it would take 5 years following his werewolf debut. Starting in 1980 with Moonknight issue 1, his origin is revisited. In this version, he saves a woman's life from the villainous bushman and his fellow mercenaries, to which Mark is betrayed and dropped deep in the desert with no way to get back to civilization. He is eventually found and brought into an Egyptian tomb, but dies and comes back to life under the statue of Khonshu. He takes a white robe from the statue and proclaims that he is a Spector of the moon and the moon's knight of vengeance, raving like a madman before he goes after Bushman and his cronies. This issue has pretty much everything: his love interest, his pilot and companion, his friends, and even the mooncopter. If you want a quick in to Moonknight, this will do it. All the pieces are there, and you can read it for free thanks to Marvel giving away digital copies via QR scan codes hidden in the Moonknight TV show. I put the links to these free comics in the description for you to peruse at your own leisure. Mark is supported by his alters as early as 1976, but they are used more like costumes he switches into rather than true alternative personalities. Think of it like a method actor and how they might use a costume. Continuing on from this, in 1979 Moonknight fights a serial killer that turns out to be Randall Spector, his brother, cementing the idea that Mark must be the true identity. That said, it is still not confirmed as D.I.D and could still be a performance with his alternative identities. In 1980, Moonknight gets an updated origin, suggesting that after Mark comes back from the dead, he acquires 3 new identities. The next year, The Committee, from Moonknight's werewolf debut, is now retconned. Khonshu's legitimacy is also questioned, leaving Mark dealing with potentially 4 alters, as Khonshu might not even be real. With the supernatural stuff tucked away for now, he focuses on street level crime. It was a while before the strange and spooky came back into Moonknight, but in 2014 it came back with a vengeance, where it is confirmed that Spector was raised from the dead by an outer terrestrial entity, and was remade to some extent by the entity's operations. It was speculated that this act is what fractured Mark's brain in order to represent the aspects of Khonshu, but in Moonknight issue 7, it is finally confirmed that Spector's disorder exists and even predates his resurrection at the feet of Khonshu. A young Mark is visiting a child psychologist, where they discuss Steven and Jake. Later, young Mark sits in a 3-way connecting hallway while his father and the doctor are talking. He's approached by Khonshu, claiming to be Mark's father. Khonshu essentially predicts Mark's death at the foot of his statue, and when that happens and Mark gains the identity of Moonknight, sometimes referred to as his 4th alter, he will be complete. In Moonknight issue 20, it's further implied that Mark is the true Moonknight, and Jake and Steven are like supporting roles. Khonshu chooses Mark as his fist. The other alters have personality traits, info or ideas that can help Mark, but they are reluctant to actually fight. The TV show is the first and only place where it suggests Mr. Knight is Steven's version of Moonknight, but the comics have not made this canonical as of yet. Speaking of Mr. Knight, he was introduced in Secret Avengers issue 19, or more specifically, the costume. As an entity, he was fleshed out in 2014 as part of the Moonknight reboot. Mr. Knight is more of a detective type character, who is meant to be more approachable than Moonknight. At the time of issue 1, Mr. Knight is already known by Detective Flint and is supported by him to help them with crime scene investigating. This insinuates this is not the first time he has helped Flint, but it's still early enough that not all the police know of Mr. Knight and believe that he is in fact Moonknight in an alternative costume. In the Disney TV series, Mr. Knight has a very different role. In this section, I'm going to focus on Moonknight as he is depicted in the series, rather than give a blow-by-blow of the actual plot. It goes without saying, there will be some kind of spoilers here, but I'll try and keep them as vague as I can so you can still enjoy the show. Episode 1 opens with us following Steven Grant as the protagonist. Yes, Steven. Why not Mark? Don't you worry your little head about that right now. You'll see. Steven is a mild-mannered everyman, with a job at a local museum. He's got a strong southern British accent, kind of quirky and nerdy. Well, he's obviously intelligent, especially when it comes to history, but perhaps a little bit socially awkward. He appears lonely and just wants love and recognition in and out of work. He suffers from sleepwalking, or at least that's what he thinks it is. So he tries to keep himself awake at night, which begins to affect his life. He's late for work every day, but still finds huge chunks of time missing from his week. He calls his mum often and tells her about this, but apart from that, there appears to be no one special in Stephen's life that can help. Episode 1 ends with Stephen being attacked in the museum when he's working alone late at night. The nightmarish jackal chases him into the bathroom, where his reflection begins talking to him. Stephen agrees to the reflection's demands to take control, and we get our first glimpse of Moonknight as he lays the smackdown on some Jekyll butt. Right away, the big difference between the comic and TV show is as clear as the moon. Stephen is the focus, not Mark. This brings a huge shift in what the viewer can expect from Moonknight. As someone who is a fan of Moonknight from the comics, I was confused at first, thinking, isn't Markspector meant to be Moonknight? I wonder what episode 2 holds in store for us. Stephen is fired from his job due to the damages caused. CCTV footage shows there was no one else but Stephen there that night, leading him to question his sanity. As Stephen begins to suspect there is something more at play than just sleep-deprived hallucinations, he begins to discover things in his flat. As he goes full detective mode, uncovering the details about Markspector, he meets Layla, who recognises Stephen, but he doesn't know her. She calls him Mark and says she's his wife. Later in the episode, Stephen summons the suit, following Layla's advice, and we are introduced to Mr. Knight, who tries to battle another jackal. He's struggling and allows Mark to take over. Moonknight is back and deals another beatdown. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, as Mark refuses to surrender control back to Stephen afterwards. Ooh, conflict. The TV show's continuity suggests that Mr. Knight is Stephen's costume and Moonknight is Mark's. If the show is your first impression of Moonknight, you wouldn't know this, but Mr. Knight in the comics is just an alias for Moonknight to be able to approach the police and do more detectiving. I love the fact that they changed this up in the TV series, giving Stephen his own super identity. The way they play it in the series is Mr. Knight is an exaggerated projection of Stephen, so more cheeky and witty with a pinch of charm. You could say Moonknight is the same to Mark, being a more dangerous version of someone who is already dangerous. Mark is now in charge of the body, so we learn more about him and his seemingly ruthless and uncaring persona. He shows he will stop at nothing to get information, and Khonshu seems to be supportive with this mentality, encouraging Mark to do what's necessary no matter the cost. During a fight with some criminals, Mark suffers a blackout, and when he wakes, the criminals are badly hurt. Stephen insists that it wasn't him, and the show to this point has shown that Mark is the more brutal one. So what happened? Despite this brutal nature, there are signs of Mark's caring side, as he seems to be trying to protect Layla, and later in the episode, they must put aside their animosity and work together. Mark isn't as intelligent as Stephen in terms of history, and so he has to let Stephen back in so they can solve a puzzle. We start to now further understand the differences between Mark and Stephen. Both personalities need to work together to solve the greater threat. With Stephen back in control after the last episode's puzzle, he and Layla progress into dangerous territory to try and recover an artifact. So far, he and Mark have battled mentally for control, often talking to each other in mirrors and reflections, but neither personality appears capable of forcibly taking control just yet. There are some more character revelations between the two and the relationship with Layla, but any further progression is abruptly cut short when Mark is shot dead. This is where the series takes a sharp turn. Up until this point, yes, there were unbelievable elements, but in universe, it was all somewhat normal. Well, Mark wakes up in a wheelchair in a clinical white room. There's a TV show playing with the main character called Dr. Stephen Grant. When Mark looks at his reflection in the glass window, he only sees himself as Mark. He's in an asylum, and the orderlies are all people we've previously met in the show. The doctor in charge is even the antagonist himself. Was everything before now just in Mark's head? Is he truly insane? During an escape attempt, he finds a sarcophagus with Stephen inside. This is the first time we are shown Mark and Stephen existing in the same space together without one being a reflection. As they try to escape with each other, they are stopped by... This is by far the best episode in my opinion. It's a harrowing back and forth between Mark and Stephen, sanity and insanity, reality and memory. I'll not spoil it here, but if I just say childhood trauma and leave it there, you know if you know, and if not, watch the show. It's worth watching just for this one episode alone. Throughout the show to this point, Stephen has been calling his mum and leaving her messages about his day, but we have never seen or heard her in response. Well, Steven only has happy memories of his mother, but Mark sees things very differently. It's a really moving episode, and Oscarisaac does an incredible performance. The scene where Mark is outside his old family home for the wake of his mother's funeral, but he can't bring himself to go in, is so well done and emotional. His father from inside beckons him in, but Mark can't do it. He breaks down, and from that moment on, he loses control. Steven wakes up in the street confused and instantly tries to ring his mum to tell her he's been sleepwalking and waking up somewhere random again. This gut punch of a scene is followed by Steven in the asylum, learning his mother is truly dead and finally understanding his role. The final episode of the show obviously focuses on wrapping up the main plot of the show, and our heroes having to try and thwart the antagonist. Since I've tried to avoid discussing that part of the show, there's not really much I can say for this episode. Steven and Mark do put on a united front for the fight, but they suffer another mysterious dual blackout. Again, fans of Moonknight will know there is a third personality, and since we've not met him in the show yet, we can deduce this blackout must be the mysterious third personality at work. Speaking of his third personality, if both Mark and Steven have a costume each, I wonder if Jake would get one of his own. There is so much that I want to say here, but maybe one day I'll do another video about Moonknight, and I can share my thoughts there without the fear of spoiling this show for you. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list and is based on my personal opinions, but I would highly recommend the following collected editions of Moonknight. I've already recommended Moonknight issue 1 for that classic Moonknight kick, but if you're not really into the whole 80s comic book aesthetic, you can try Moonknight from the Dead. Mark is back as Moonknight and Mr. Knight as he helps the police crack another case involving a selective serial killer, stopping a sniper with his sights set on revenge, fighting angry ghosts, taking part in psychedelic dream experiments, saving a little girl from an organised crime group, and even fighting the Black Spector, who is desperate to make a name for himself. This is a great introduction to modern Moonknight. The writing is confident and precise, perfectly complemented by the inviting art that just smacks of style. These initial 6 issues are self-contained, but with little nods to previous issues and storylines that build wonderfully on one another. This sets the groundwork for the next 2 collections in the 2014 Moonknight series. Moonknight Lunatic. Mark teeters on the edge of sanity when he finds himself in an asylum and told he's been there since he was 12 years old and that he has did. Steven and Jake are not real, and that must mean Khonshu and the Moonknight personas aren't real too, right? As Moonknight's perception of reality warps and bends, what's real and what's not becomes a confusing blur in this tense battle to escape the asylum and regain his freedom and sanity, assuming he's not already insane. It's perfect for fans of the TV show, as this is the comic that was used as the inspiration, at least for the second half of the series anyway. It shows Moonknight in his most human state, and as the reader, you're very much being dragged around in his head, leaving you with a sense of confusion and questioning what is real and what is make-believe. Moonknight, the bottom. What does a lunatic do when he hits rock bottom? When all his friends have gone? When his god deserts him? What then? Well, Markspector looks to the past before Bushman took his legs from him, before he took Bushman's face. The people who are out to get him might think Mark is a broken man. Moonknight has waxed and waned and has had his final eclipse. But what they don't realise is that a wounded animal is a dangerous animal. Imagine if that animal felt trapped, backed against the wall. Well, when a lunatic hits rock bottom, he can only go up from there. This is probably the closest you're going to get to Moonknight as Batman, with Charlie Huston, who wrote crime novels prior to his work in the comics industry. Oh, and yeah, he worked on the Gotham TV series, so yeah, Batman. Add to this David Finch on penciling duties, who is famous for his work on various Batman series, so again, Batman. Both The Bottom and Midnight Sun are great stories with mature and dynamic art, but I would shy away from recommending them to someone who is new to Moonknight, as it relies a bit on the legacy of the character, and for that reason, I think newcomers might find the series harder to get into, but it is very rewarding with brutally beautiful art and an engaging story of a man who is trying to rebuild his life from, well, the bottom up. Bonus feature! Not exactly a recommendation, but I don't know where else to talk about this. There is a Moonknight manga that exists. It was released between 1979 and 1980, with Moonknight looking more like he's straight out of Kamen Rider than a Marvel comic. But if only Toei had produced the anime. No, seriously, Toei and Marvel had a deal to do a bunch of anime based on Marvel heroes, but only Tomb of Dracula ever saw the light of day, unfortunately. Actually, Supervisor Ray, can we get a comparison between the manga Moonknight and casshan? Yeah, that's the one. Look at what we could have had. Thanks, Ray. Oh, and before we get into the alternate reality, how do you think Moonknight connects with my last video about Mick Foley? Let us speculate. What if markspector had a child? Mark is cursed to continue his nightly crusade at Khonshu's behest, but perhaps Khonshu starts looking for younger blood as Mark ages and slows down. Mark would feel Khonshu start to pull towards his daughter as a new candidate for Moonknight, but he doesn't wish this on her. The pain he has to endure, it's unbearable. No one should suffer as he has. So, maybe if she has the patronage of a different god, Khonshu would be unable to claim her for himself. Enter Thoth and Seshat. Thoth is another moon god like Khonshu, which is why he would be interested in Miss Spector, as a tie to the moon could be a familial attribute. What's interesting is that he wasn't only a god of the moon, but also time, writing, wisdom and knowledge, science and magic, arbitration of the gods, and judger of the dead. Whereas his daughter, Seshat, was known as the feminine counterpart to Thoth, and was the divine measurer and scribe, mistress of the House of Books, and was able to restore the limbs of the deceased. It could be that when Mark's daughter is Thoth's avatar, she has the ability to slow time and use magic, but is more of a pacifist seeking a non-violent path or a way to quickly incapacitate their opponent. Whereas when she is Seshat's avatar, she uses a spear as another mode of attack by throwing or thrusting with it, or using it defensively by spinning it like a bow staff. I believe she would be more animalistic in her fighting style and quicker to temper, but she would have sympathy for the dead and the damned, trying to heal or fix them. Whereas when she is Thoth's avatar, she might be more level-headed and judgmental of the dead. As for who she is, I don't believe she would be a sufferer of D.I.D, but I think it would be interesting instead for her two guardian gods to vie for her full attention. As for a name, well, with Mark being Jewish, I think a fitting name for his daughter would be Liviana Spector. Liviana meaning white moon in Hebrew. If she was Thoth's avatar, I'd call her Pallid Ba. Pallid meaning pale and short for paladin, you know, like a knight. And Ba being a form of winged spirit from Egyptian mythology. If she was Seshat's avatar, she would be known simply as Ma'at, or Ma'at of the Dark, as this was the feather used to weigh against one's heart in the afterlife to see if they were a good person. I could see her working alongside or maybe even against other Marvel characters like Ghost Rider, Morbius or Blade, you know, those who only come out at night. I've been a fan of Moonknight for the longest time, so I'm glad to see him getting a bit of mainstream attention in the form of his TV series and recent comic book releases. If you were a fan before this video, I hope I've done old Mooney justice. If not, and you'd never heard of him, I hope you've enjoyed learning about another masked weirdo, and maybe I've made you a fan. I'm going to tempt fate now and say the future is looking bright for Spector. Here's to a long and bright future as the Lunar Legionnaire. I'll let Khonshu conclude this video with his description on what Moonknight is.
To my hands, my eyes, my vengeance, to be my final words against evildoers, to bind your very being to me and eradicate only the worst, those who deserve it. Your mind, I feel it, fractured, broken. In exchange for your life, you swear to protect the travelers of the night and bring the vengeance to those who would do them harm. Rise and live again as my fist of vengeance, as my Moonknight.
And so, with that all said, thank you for your time. I wish you a good day and many more besides. Yours, forever in horror, 226.
I think that we should buy some more minis. Yes, absolutely, yes, yes. Let's do that. Let's go now. No more minis.